There comes a point in every believer's life when the silence of heaven feels louder than any storm. You pray, you cry, you worship, and still, there's no sign, no voice, no movement. You wonder if God has turned his face away, if somehow you've done something to drive his presence from your life. The silence becomes heavy, like a weight pressing down on your soul. But what many fail to see in those moments is that silence is not absence. God's silence is not proof of his distance. It's often the very evidence that he is working more deeply than words can describe. When God is silent, it doesn't mean he's ignoring you. It means he's listening more intently than ever. It means he's watching your faith take shape, even when you can't see him at work. Think of a teacher during an exam. The room is quiet not because the teacher has left, but because the test has begun. God's silence often comes in those seasons when he wants to see how deeply you trust him, how firmly you can stand when there's nothing left to hold on to except his word. It's not punishment, it's preparation. It's not rejection, it's refinement. So many times, the Bible shows us this pattern. Joseph was thrown into a pit, then a prison, and for years he heard nothing from heaven. But the silence was shaping him into the man who would one day save nations. David cried out in the Psalms, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" Yet it was in that same silence that God was molding him into a king after his own heart. Even Jesus, on the cross, cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But in that divine silence, the greatest redemption story in history was unfolding. The silence of God has never meant the absence of God. It has always meant that something holy is being written, even when the pen is invisible to you. When God is quiet, he's teaching you to trust, not in what you feel, but in what you know. Feelings will scream that you're alone, that your prayers don't matter, that your faith is wasted. But faith was never meant to depend on emotions. Faith grows strongest in the soil of uncertainty. It's when you don't hear God that you learn to hold on to his promises with a new kind of strength. The absence of his voice forces you to lean on the memory of his faithfulness. You start to remember every storm he's already calmed, every prayer he's already answered, every moment he carried you when you didn't even realize it. That remembrance becomes your anchor in the quiet. Sometimes silence is how God protects you. If he spoke too soon, you might move before the timing is right. You might grab the blessing before your character can carry it. There are seasons where he hides the next step, not to confuse you, but to keep you safe. If you could see the full picture, you might not be ready for it. So he keeps you still, covered under the shadow of his wings, until your spirit is mature enough to walk in what he's preparing for you. His silence is not his withdrawal, it's his shelter. He hides you in the quiet so he can heal what noise would only wound. You see, God's silence also invites you into deeper intimacy. When the noise fades, when the voices of the world stop, that's when you start to hear the faint whispers of his presence that you missed before. In the silence, your heart learns to listen differently. You begin to notice the small signs, how he speaks through a sunrise, through a scripture that suddenly breathes life, through a peace that doesn't make sense in your pain. That's the language of a silent God, a God who speaks in ways that ears can't catch, but hearts can feel. We often want answers, but God gives us awareness. We want explanations, but He offers experience. And in that stillness, we begin to see that maybe what we needed wasn't another word from God, but a deeper revelation of who He is. Silence strips away our dependency on circumstances. It pulls us out of our need for control. It makes us kneel, surrender, and whisper, "Even if I don't hear you, I still trust you." That's when true faith begins. Not when we understand everything, but when we trust Him despite not understanding anything. There's also a sacred strength that grows only in the quiet. People who have walked through God's silence emerge with a kind of peace that can't be shaken. They've learned to trust God in the dark, so they no longer panic when the lights go out. They've seen that even when prayers seem unanswered, God is still faithful. The silence teaches endurance, patience, and humility, qualities that can't be learned through blessings alone. You begin to realize that the silence didn't break you, it built you. It was the fire that refined your faith, burning away the impurities of fear and doubt until only genuine trust remained. So, the next time you feel like heaven has gone quiet, don't mistake it for abandonment. Look closer. Feel deeper. God is there, maybe not shouting, maybe not revealing, but still sustaining you with invisible grace. Every heartbeat you take in that silence is proof that He hasn't left. He's closer than you think, holding you together, guiding your steps, even when you can't see the path. One day, when the silence finally breaks, you'll look back and realize that what you called loneliness was actually God's gentle hand leading you towards something greater. Faith that's built only on God's voice can crumble when He's quiet. But faith that learns to trust in His silence will stand through any storm, because silence teaches you that your relationship with God isn't built on constant communication. It's built on constant connection. Even when He doesn't speak, He's still present. Even when you can't trace His hand, you can still trust His heart. And in that realization, peace floods in. God's silence is one of the most misunderstood gifts of faith. It feels empty, but it's full of unseen purpose. It feels distant, but it's saturated with divine presence. When the noise of your fear fades and your spirit becomes still, you begin to understand that He never left. He was closer in the silence than He ever was in the noise. And one day, when He finally speaks again, you'll realize that His silence wasn't the space between His love. It was the echo of it. There are moments in life when the pain feels unbearable, when every breath feels heavy, and every prayer feels like it dies before it reaches heaven. You cry out to God, but all you feel is emptiness. You look for signs of His presence, but all you see are shadows. You start to believe that maybe He's gone, that maybe He's left you to face this suffering alone. Yet what you don't realize is that pain is often the very proof of His presence. God doesn't abandon His children in their pain. He enters it with them. He walks beside you in the valley. not to spare you from every sorrow, but to strengthen you through it. What you feel as agony, He is using as intimacy. When you're in pain, your heart becomes tender, open, and desperate. It's in that desperation that God draws closer. The moments when tears soak your pillow are the moments when heaven leans in the closest. You may not feel His hand, but it's there wiping the tears you can't control. You may not hear His voice, but it's whispering comfort into your soul in ways your mind can't yet interpret. Pain has a strange power. It strips away everything superficial and forces you to face what's eternal. And in that stripped down silence, you realize that the God who seemed distant is actually closer than your own heartbeat. Many people think that the presence of pain means the absence of God, but that's one of the greatest lies the enemy tells. If that were true, then the cross itself would have been proof that God had abandoned His Son. But the truth is the opposite. The cross was the ultimate proof that God was fully present in pain. Jesus hung between heaven and earth, suffering in flesh, yet the Father's plan was being fulfilled in that very agony. It was through the pain that redemption was born. If God could bring salvation through the suffering of His own Son, He can certainly bring purpose out of your own. Sometimes pain is how God speaks the loudest. Not through words, but through transformation. When life is easy, we tend to drift. We become comfortable, self-sufficient, distracted. But when pain enters the picture, it shakes us awake. It breaks the illusion that we are in control. It reminds us that we are human, fragile, and utterly dependent on divine strength. Pain is the place where pride dies and surrender begins. And in that surrender, you find a closeness to God that comfort could never offer. If you've ever been through deep pain, you know it changes the way you pray. You stop praying rehearsed prayers and start praying real ones. You stop trying to impress God with words and start crying out from your soul. You don't ask for more blessings. You ask for more strength. You don't ask for things to go back to how they were. You ask to be transformed. Pain purifies your faith like fire refines gold. It burns away shallow religion and reveals a raw, honest relationship with God. That kind of faith can't be taught in books. It's learned in the furnace of suffering. There's a story of a silversmith who was asked how he knows when the silver is pure. He said, "When I can see my reflection in it." That's what God does through our pain. He allows the heat to rise, not to destroy us, but to purify us until His image is reflected in our lives. Every tear, every heartbreak, every sleepless night becomes part of that refining fire. You may feel like you're breaking, but in truth, you're being shaped into something more beautiful, more compassionate, more like Him. When we suffer, God doesn't stand far away watching. He steps into the fire with us, just like He did with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He doesn't always remove the flames, but He makes sure they don't consume you. His presence becomes the fourth figure in your furnace, unseen by others, but undeniable to your spirit. That's why people who've walked through deep pain often radiate a strange kind of peace. It's not because they escaped the fire, but because they met God inside it. You might not realize it now, But pain can be a sacred place. It's where heaven touches the brokenness of earth. It's where divine love meets human weakness. It's where you learn that God's presence isn't always a shout. It's often a whisper that holds you when you're too weak to stand. You'll find that in your weakest moments, when your prayers are nothing but tears, His strength becomes your breath. Pain teaches you what worship truly means. It's not singing when life is good. It's lifting your trembling hands when your world is falling apart and still saying, "You are worthy." God never promised a life without pain. He promised His presence in the midst of it. He didn't say the storm wouldn't come. He said He would be in the boat with you when it does. When you realize that, your perspective changes. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What are you showing me through this?" The pain that once felt like punishment begins to reveal itself as preparation. Every wound becomes a doorway to deeper wisdom. Every tear becomes a seed for future joy. Think of how seeds grow. They're buried in darkness, pressed under the weight of the earth. But that pressure, that hidden pain, is what makes them break open and sprout new life. Your pain works the same way. It's not a grave, it's a garden. What feels like the end is actually the beginning of something beautiful. God uses pain to bring forth fruit that comfort never could. Compassion, humility, resilience, empathy. These grow only in the soil of suffering. And one day, when you look back, you'll realize that the very thing you thought would destroy you became the thing that revealed God to you. You'll remember the nights you thought you wouldn't make it, and you'll smile. Not because it was easy, but because He was there. You'll see that every tear had a purpose, every loss had a lesson, and every wound became a witness of His faithfulness. Pain doesn't last forever, but the strength it produces does. So if you're walking through a season of pain right now, don't believe the lie that you're alone. Don't think for a second that God has turned His face away. He's closer now than He's ever been. You may not feel Him, but He's there in every breath, in every moment, holding you up when your strength is gone. And when the pain finally passes, you'll realize that what carried you through wasn't your own endurance. It was His presence. Pain didn't prove that God was absent, it proved that He was faithful. The same God who walked with you through the fire will be the one waiting on the other side, smiling, saying, "I never left you." There comes a time when God leads you into a season where everyone seems to disappear. The phone stops ringing, friends fade into the background, and the people who once promised to stand by you quietly move away. It's in that lonely, silent place that you start to wonder if maybe you did something wrong, if maybe you've been forgotten, not just by people, but by God Himself. Yet what feels like isolation is not abandonment, it's divine separation. God is not punishing you, He's preparing you. He's pulling you away from distractions so He can reveal Himself in ways that the crowd would never let you see. Every season of isolation carries within it a revelation, a moment when you begin to see that what was falling apart was actually falling into place. When God wants to grow you, He first gets you alone. He calls you away from the noise because his whisper can't compete with the world's volume. Think about Moses, raised in Pharaoh's palace, surrounded by luxury and influence, but it was in the wilderness, far away from everyone, that he heard God's voice through a burning bush. David was anointed to be king, but before he wore the crown, he spent years in caves and fields, alone with God and his sheep. Even Jesus himself withdrew, often to lonely places to pray. Isolation has always been the meeting ground of divine transformation. When God removes people from your life, He's not taking something from you. He's making room to put something greater within you. The world tells you that isolation means rejection, but heaven sees it differently. God knows that some revelations can only be birthed in silence. When you're surrounded by people, their opinions can drown out God's direction. But when you're alone, you start to hear Him clearly. You begin to see that His plan for you was never meant to be understood by everyone. Some people had to leave because their voices would have confused what God was trying to say. Some doors had to close because if they stayed open, you would have settled for comfort instead of calling. Sometimes God isolates you not to deprive you, but to define you. In isolation, your identity becomes refined. You start to see yourself not through the lens of others' approval, but through the truth of who God says you are. When the applause stops, you're forced to ask, who am I when no one is watching? And in that question, God begins to show you that your worth isn't tied to recognition, success, or relationships. It's anchored in His love. It's when you lose everything familiar that you find everything eternal. The silence becomes sacred. The loneliness becomes a classroom where God teaches you the lessons that cannot be learned in comfort. At first, isolation feels painful. It feels unfair. You see others moving forward, succeeding, celebrating, while you're left behind in the quiet. But don't mistake delay for denial. God's timing is never late, and His process is never wasted. He's using that hidden season to build in you what will sustain you later. He's developing strength, patience, and discernment. He's teaching you how to hear His voice when no one else is speaking faith into you. He's preparing your spirit to handle the blessings that would have crushed you if you'd received them too early. You may feel forgotten, but you are being formed. You are in God's workshop where every silent day has purpose, every tear has meaning, and every moment is crafting your destiny. When God isolates you, He's also protecting you. There are attacks you never saw because He hid you from them. There are betrayals you were spared because He pulled you away before they could happen. Sometimes He allows you to lose people because their presence would have delayed your progress. What you think is loneliness is often divine protection in disguise. You might cry over the ones who left, but one day you'll thank God they did. Because if they had stayed, you would have missed the version of yourself that God was trying to bring forth. In that season of isolation, your prayers change. You stop asking for company and start asking for clarity. You stop chasing people and start chasing purpose. You begin to realize that peace is not found in proximity to others. It's found in intimacy with God. You learn to walk with Him, to talk with Him, to depend on Him. You discover that His presence is more satisfying than any relationship or success you could have imagined. When you're isolated, you're not alone. You're in divine company. The same God who was with Joseph in the prison, Daniel in the lion's den, Elijah under the tree, and Jesus in the wilderness is with you now. His presence doesn't always roar. Sometimes it rests quietly on your spirit, strengthening you in ways words can't express. And then one day, when the season of isolation ends, you emerge different. You come out with a stillness in your soul that can't be shaken by chaos. You come out with discernment, able to see through people's words and recognize their spirits. You come out knowing that your value doesn't come from being seen, but from being chosen. You stop chasing the validation of others because you've already encountered the approval of God. That's the power of isolation. It breaks you, but only to rebuild you stronger. It empties you, but only to fill you with wisdom. It separates you, but only to prepare you for connection that aligns with your purpose. The revelation you receive in isolation changes how you live in community. You no longer seek people to complete you. You seek people who align with the calling God has placed within you. You stop fearing solitude because you've learned that God speaks the loudest in the quiet. The lessons you learn in the cave become the strength that carries you into the palace. The pain that once felt unbearable becomes the very proof that God was near all along. And when you finally look back, you realize that isolation was never about losing people. It was about finding God. It was never about being left behind. It was about being set apart. The separation was necessary for the revelation. If He hadn't pulled you away, you would have missed His whisper. If He hadn't allowed the loneliness, you would have settled for lesser loves. If He hadn't closed those doors, you would have walked down the wrong path. Everything that left you was part of the pruning, and every quiet moment was part of His promise. So don't despise your season of isolation. Don't rush it, don't resist it. Sit with it. Let God do what He's doing in the hidden place. The people who forgot you will one day see the glory that was being built in your silence. The ones who doubted you will witness the strength that was forged when no one was watching. God's process may feel lonely, but it's never empty. Every moment you spend alone with Him is a brick in the foundation of your destiny. One day, you'll realize that the silence wasn't punishment. It was sacred preparation. You'll look back and see that in the season when you thought you were most alone, God was closer than ever, shaping your heart, refining your faith, and revealing the version of you that could finally carry His glory. In the end, when we look back over every tear, every sleepless night, and every unanswered prayer, we realize that God never abandoned us, not for a single moment. He was there in the silence, working when we couldn't see it. He was there in the pain, holding us when we were too weak to stand. He was there in the isolation, shaping our hearts and preparing us for something far greater than we imagined. The silence was His classroom, the pain was His touch, and the loneliness was His invitation to come closer. What once looked like abandonment now shines as evidence of His love. Because sometimes God draws back His hand so we'll seek His heart. Sometimes He removes the noise so we'll learn to recognize His whisper. And sometimes He lets everything else fade away so we'll finally see that He was never gone. He was simply bringing us into deeper intimacy with Him. So if you are in a season where heaven feels quiet, take heart. You're not forgotten, you're being formed. You're not being punished, you're being prepared. The God who feels distant is actually closer than ever, working all things together for your good. Hold on to faith when it makes no sense, and one day you'll look back and thank Him for the silence that saved your soul. Because it was in that stillness that your spirit learned the greatest truth of all, that even in the darkest valley, He was right there beside you, whispering, "You're never alone." Thank you for listening. And may this message remind you that no matter what season you're in, God's presence has never left your life. His silence is not the end of your story. It's the space where miracles are being written. May you walk away today with peace in your heart, strength in your spirit, and the unshakable assurance that God is closer than you've ever known. God bless you, and thank you.